so much drama in the NYC. It's kinda hard just to be the richest one won't be, but I somehow in some way keep thinking on philosophical shit like every single day. Can I kick a little something to the scientists and make a few arguments for divine? There's 2 in the morning and the argument's still jumping cause the whiskey ain't gone. I got clients in the living room getting it on. Radical triple take till 6 in the morning. So what you wanna do? I got a pocket full of arguments and my homeboys do too. So turn up the lights and get the whiteboards. What? Most ponies, of course? Yeah. So we gonna smoke an ounce to this. Peas up, walks down while you're more.
Alright, hello and welcome to the very first exciting episode of Consciousness this month. Trying to do a semi-regular series of videos where I spout off about current events going on and related to consciousness, something very interested in. And this is the first episode. We'll see how it goes. Maybe in the future I'll invite some guests to talk about controversial issues. Who knows what's going on? But there's a lot going on with respect to consciousness now. And it's a kind of interesting discussion that's going on centered upon conferences related to consciousness. So there is the Tucson conference, which has been going on for quite some time, and also the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. Both of these are sort of the main conferences for people who are interested in the scientific approach to consciousness. There's a couple of others, and here and there, but I think these are the main ones. For instance, currently right now there's the Human Brain Project having its conference on foundational issues, understanding consciousness.
Give me a brain! Give me a brain!
So what's kind of started this off was an article which came out recently, right after the Science of Consciousness in Tucson ended, and in that article, the argument was basically made that the Tucson conference is a circus. It's not serious, and it may actually be doing serious harm to the study of consciousness by, for instance, inviting people like Deepak Chopra to be keynote speakers. He's been there every year for the last few years. Now, of course, I figured I'd say something about this as someone who's loosely associated with these conferences. I started my very first presentation at a conference was not at Tucson, but it was right around that time, back in 2002, when I went to Tucson for the first time with my psychology laboratory that I was working with at the time. And I presented some of my work on Hermann grade. So that was as a poster presentation. And I remember just being completely floored by the fact that there was this giant conference, which was all devoted to serious study of consciousness. And I learned a tremendous amount. And I went back after that time 5 more times. So I've been to the Science of Consciousness conference 6 times. I presented posters, I've given talks, and in 2016 I gave a plenary talk. So I sort of worked my way up from the ranks, if you want to think of it that way. Now on the other side, there's the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. And I have been to that conference many times as well. So I went there for the first time in 2003. I was a graduate student, had just moved to the East Coast, and I presented a poster there. I presented posters, I presented talks, and then in 2013, I organized a symposium that was a plenary session. So in both cases, I started out kind of giving posters and working my way up, giving talks, and then finally gave a talk on the big stage. Now, of course, I don't know if I'll be back at these conferences. That's not really what this was about. The point of this was to kind of, as someone who's been to both of these, to kind of compare them and to say, ask whether there's any merit to this critique that the Tucson conference is kind of a wild circus where anything goes. And I certainly remember that when I first went to Tucson, I was just happy to be there. And then the next time I went there, I gave a talk. That's where I met Hakuan Lau. He was the chair of the session that I gave a talk in. I made many great connections, serious people. And of course, there was always an element at Tucson of people that were into things that I didn't consider worthwhile, mystical approaches and so forth and so on. And of course, they didn't consider what I was into worthwhile, because I'm into a pretty hardcore kind of identity theory, reductionism, cognitive approaches to consciousness. So there was always these kind of different camps at Tucson. And happily, though, we just sort of sorted ourselves into different groups. and people went to some talks, and then people went to other talks, and people went to some dinners, and other people went to different dinners, and there was this nice kind of coexisting, and you could kind of have conversations with people from different points of view, but you had the sense that this was a serious conference, or at least I did back in the early 2000s. I became somewhat disillusioned with Tucson one of the times that I went there, and my talk, was in a session, a concurrent session. At that time, that was before I gave my plenary talk on the big stage. And the talk, there's 6 other people in a session that lasts 2 hours, and the chair didn't really do a great job managing the time. I won't name names, but this person's still around. And I was the last speaker, so I got 10 minutes to give my talk and ask questions. It's supposed to be 20 minutes, so it's about half the time. And I was really angry because I paid a lot of money to fly out there and to present at this conference. And I really started to have the feeling that this was like a bit of a scam. They charge $500 for the conference fee. They cram as many people as they can into these concurrent sessions, seemingly accepting all sorts of stuff and just jamming them into these sessions. And then worse yet, they have the poster session just full of stuff. And you start to think about all the money that they're taking in. I was really mad. I was like, okay, this needs to be more focused on discussion. Incidentally, that's why I decided to start the Online Consciousness Conference, which coming up on the 10-year anniversary of that seems relevant. I wanted a conference where it was just all about the discussion, and it wasn't about conference fees or making sure that you had an ID tag to get into a session or something like that. So that was my take on that. Now, the ASSC was something completely different. It didn't have the circus feel. It never had the feeling that there were all of these different approaches, and there was a big tent. There was a lot of working scientists and philosophers who were interested in the workings of science and trying to work together. So there was more of a concerted effort, I felt, at the ASSC, more of a focus on trying to understand the cutting-edge science as opposed to exploring all kinds of alternative views. And these differences, one sort of inclusive, including everybody, the other kind of narrowly focused on a certain set of scientific issues, they have become magnified over the years. And at this point, I sort of tend to agree that Tucson really is no longer a serious conference. It's not just that they have a wide variety of views, because there are a wide variety of views and they should be represented, but it's rather that I think it's called the science of consciousness. It used to be called Towards the Science of Consciousness. They've changed that. But what they're trying to indicate is that the science of consciousness is an established field. It should be thought of as like the science of attention. That's personally my view as well, that it should be thought of as like the science of attention or visual perception, another area of neuroscience, except with studying consciousness. Except for that if someone who was interested in science went to this conference, they would have the opposite impression. They would tend to think that quantum mechanics and panpsychism and weird crystal vibrations were the kind of norm in science. And of course, that is not the case.